Kia ora, hello. This is the final episode for Season 1 and the final episode for the year. We plan to be back on the 12th of January with Season 2, so keep an eye out for that. This week, we will be continuing our series on the growth of the medieval city. This will give us the foundations to be able to discuss the riders of the guilds and by extension, the medieval middle class. Ultimately, the rise of the cities and the flourishing of the middle class was the death of feudalism in Western Europe. Last time, we spoke about the rise of the medieval cities in brief, from the fall of the Roman Empire to what factors led to the collapse of the Roman cities to the reinvention of the medieval cities beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries. If you've not watched that video, pop over and have a watch. I promise you, it's not a ploy to get you to watch all of our videos. It's called incremental learning. It's a thing. As usual, all of our sources and links are in the description below. We discussed how merchants settled in cities, that initially this was both for security and how to organize their trade interests. I'm going to cheat a bit here and quickly discuss feudalism. Feudalism. Who hasn't heard about feudalism? Between you and me, when most people discuss feudalism, it's just oversimplifying the same tired points. So, let me just do the same thing here again. Feudalism, the watered down version. Because it's not like it was a complex system or anything. We have our 3 estates. Well, technically 4, if you want to take a radical view. But we're not going to do that here, remember. I'll be covering that later when we discuss women in the medieval workforce. Anyway, so we have our 3 estates. The prayers, the fighters, and the workers. This is based on a hierarchy, each person swearing oaths to the person above them in exchange for protection. And this goes all the way up to God. The person above is bound by this oath to supply that protection. They extract a tax, be it cash, warriors, food, or labor. Should one person break that pact, they have the right to extract punishment, be it fines, censure, or violence. So if a baron does not protect his serfs, the king can intercede. Or if the serfs do not supply a tax to the baron can extract punishment. And if anyone does anything ungodly, then the church intercedes, remembering that the church is also feudal landowners. Now, it's actually way more complex and fascinating than that, as all history is. And we'll be covering that in our feudalism videos to come. I've spoken before how under feudalism merchants occupied a space outside of the feudal structure. During the 9th and 10th century, merchants were itinerant traders. Without a liege, they had no protection afforded to them under the legal system. Should they be wronged by another, they could not turn to a lord for intercession. Since they occupied this weird space as travellers, they were viewed as outsiders and treated with suspicion. Merchants could have their goods confiscated by a local functionary and have no legal recourse. Merchants began to congregate near the burgeoning cities to find security. As I had mentioned in our last videos on the cities, this is also where craftspeople had begun to move to. This is a symbiotic relationship with benefits to all parties, the merchants, the craftspeople, and the feudal lords of the town. The merchants could purchase the goods from the craftspeople to trade. The craftspeople had access to a larger market. The feudal landowner of the town collected taxes and provided protection to both. All these cities became wealthier. Craftspeople and merchants realized that the feudal lords did not perhaps have their best interests in mind. Instead, interested in protecting their monopoly they had on power. Merchants and craftspeople could not engage in trade or craft without permission. Access to land and resource were a feudal right and only granted by the feudal owner. It is in the late 11th century and beginning of the 12th century, we find groups of people approaching the feudal landowners and asking for group rights to trade. Perhaps the earliest examples of this happened in 1106 in Worms, where 23 fishermen approached the bishop and requested corporate hereditary rights to the wholesale market in fish. This may be the first written example of the formation of a guild. Again, I tease with the coveted guild video. And this is not it. It's coming, I promise. While this is the first written example, it may not be the first, and it was not the last. During the 12th and 13th centuries, there is a slew of guilds, both merchant and trade, being formed. As these guilds gain wealth and power, so too do the cities they occupy. It becomes inevitable that the merchants wish to escape the restrictions feudalism imposes on their enterprises. So like the original founders of the guilds in the previous centuries, late 13th and 14th century city leaders sought to free themselves from the mantle of rulership and self-govern. The Italian communes had obviously begun this process far earlier than their northern European counterparts, starting this in the 11th century, but as we know, Italy has always been the trendsetters for Europe. What this process is informally recognized as in sweeping terms is the Free Charter. Although the actual terms of how each country approached this and how the feudal owners responded to this request is different depending on the region and the period. Often this was purchased from the crown and renewed after a term. If payment failed, the charter was lost and the town would return to the hands of the feudal landowner. Other times this was declared, as is the case of the northern Italian communes. In England, for example, on the granting of a free charter, a city or town would be declared a borough and be entitled to the rights of self-government. This, however, did not absolve the town of feudal duties. They still had to pay taxes and provide manpower in an attack should the need arise. Again, these obligations are different from city to city and from century to century. In France, towns granted a free charter were good towns. Again, the inhabitants were lessened the slack of the burdens of feudal life in exchange for taxes and other provisions. It was from these good towns the French Parliament drew representatives for national assemblies. If we look to the Holy Roman Empire, they have the free cities. Again, each have their own arrangements depending on their charters. Without going into the actual processes and provisions of each of these charters and systems, what is important here is that the weight of the wealth and political might of the cities and the rising power of the merchants were recognized by the traditional feudal lords. We have established how the cities have started and that they have freed themselves from feudal rule. In our last video on the subject, we have mentioned that a peasant could escape to a city for a year and a day and be considered free. Through the Free Charter and the use of the guild, medieval townspeople were able to secure for themselves a place outside the feudal structure that previously was a precarious position for them. The charters established and guaranteed rights, or customs. What we have here is the tipping point, one that is often overlooked in conversations of medieval history. When merchants and tradespeople began to incorporate in the early city, they collected their power. They were able to use both their economic power and again political power to secure for themselves a new set of protections, where once a system was set up to benefit the oligarchy, again through the medieval ideas of mutual aid, the end result is an establishment of a new system. With the declaration of free communes and self-government outside of or within the bounds of feudalism, merchants were free to develop the ideas and foundations of capitalism and individualism during the late medieval and Renaissance periods. It was these ideas that led to the eventual transition from feudalism to democracy, although this process would take centuries. As I mentioned earlier, this will be our last video for the year. I hope you and yours have a safe and wonderful holiday and a great new year. We'll be back soon. We will have more sewing videos on the way for our fans that are really into sewing. See you soon. Oh, hi. You're still here. It means you must have enjoyed the video. So please like, comment and subscribe. And have a lovely holiday. Stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.